Recently I've been watching videos about the Canadian military, and one I watched recently touched on Canada in World War One and how feared they were and some of the things they got up to. And today I'm going to be learning more about that specifically. This is what World War One Germans thought about Canadian soldiers. And yeah, of course I watched the video before that said a few things what happened, and it seemed obviously that Canadians could be quite brutal in World War One, but I said in that video that I understand it because what Germans were doing to Canadians and other Allied soldiers was a lot worse. And yeah, it's war at the end of the day. Like, so interested to learn what the Germans actually thought about Canadian soldiers. Let's watch. Tell me what you think. Canadian cruelty. I mean, you can say that as well. Like I just said, like Canadian cruelty, but the Germans, from what I've learned, were far more cruel. Were far more barbaric, gassing Canadians and so on, doing some horrible things. I think there was talk of them like crucifying a Canadian like leader, military leader, things like that. So you can understand it.
On the Western Front in World War I, late in 1914, both sides paused to figure out their next moves. The race to the sea had already transpired with no favorable results except entrenchment all along the front. With the Christmas season approaching, many areas had an informal truce to bury their dead and exchange goods like cigarettes and souvenirs. They even swapped newspapers and had football matches in no man's land. A year later, it was the Canadian Corps' first Christmas on the Western Front, and in a trench near Ypres, the Germans invited them over for a party, possibly thinking that it would be a replay of the Christmas truce the year before. Some German soldiers poked their heads above the trench and waved a box of cigars, wishing the Canadians a Merry Christmas. A Canadian sergeant responded by opening fire, hitting two of the hopeful Germans. The Germans returned fire and shot a Canadian in the head. That quickly put an end to any possible Christmas gathering. This was a preview of things to come.
I mean, that one you can kind of understand. That's 1 year later, 1 year of war later. Probably so many bad things have happened to Canadians and Allied soldiers in that time. Like, it would take a lot to trust people at that time after a year of war, man. So I can completely understand why they never, like, that could have been a trap from the Germans. They were just not to know, like, why even risk it, honestly.
In World War I, Canadian soldiers would fight hard and win victories that other Allied armies could not. However, this reputation would be tainted with a brutality that friend and foe would remember into the next war years later. In an earlier video from Immersis Tech, it was mentioned that World War II German POWs called Canadians barbarians. In this video, we'll try to describe the tragedies that happened in the trenches of the Great War and some possible reasons why. A first-hand witness felt that Canadians were particularly obsessed with killing Germans, calling their war a kind of vendetta. Another outside observer noted, the troops that had the worst reputation for acts of violence against prisoners were the Canadians.
Again, he says, like, the thing is, like, how do you gauge who wants to kill each other more? They just want to kill each other at the end of the day, both of these sides. So it's like whether one wants to do it more than the other. Like, maybe wanting to do it more is because they just want to, like, I think someone said in the comments of the previous video, they just wanted the war over. They wanted to end the war because, like, they don't want to prolong the suffering of every soldier that's in the war. So they were more, you can say, like, brutal, whatever, like, just to try and end it as quickly as possible, which makes sense to me.
In one particularly cruel event, Lieutenant Keane described the practice of lobbing tins of corned beef into the neighboring German trench. When the Canadians started hearing happy shouts of, "More! Give us more!" then they let loose with an armload of grenades.
Yeah, I've seen that in the
Others
previous
were
video.
cold-blooded executions. In one case, a Canadian soldier surreptitiously slipped a live grenade into the greatcoat pocket of a German prisoner. Another veteran described how his unit came across 2 wandering Germans. They decided that they couldn't safely be spared and drew straws to see who would kill them. But killing prisoners wasn't the only brutality. Another was the nighttime raid. This was one of the Germans' greatest fears. Trench raids were the First World War at its most brutal. It was hand-to-hand fighting in crowded, darkened chaos. One has to only imagine what it would be like to wake up to screams, explosions, and gunshots, not knowing where the enemy was. Whole dugouts of sleeping Germans were killed by tossed grenades and other means. Surprised and terrified defenders were mercilessly bayoneted or machine-gunned as they fled for the rear. While all Commonwealth units were encouraged to conduct trench raids, Canadians were widely regarded as trench raiding's most enthusiastic practitioners and innovators. They wore thick rubber gloves and blackened their faces for maximum stealth. They crafted homemade pipe bombs and grenade catapults to increase their killing power. They made fearsome homemade weapons that Canadian trench raiders plunged into the faces and chests of their enemy.
Well, I mean, when you see that, that does look pretty mad. But again, like, we can say what you like about things like this, but at the end of the day, it's a war. We say, like, all's fair in love and war, and, like, it seems like the Canadians were just very good at what they do. It's not about being more brutal, being this and that. It's like they wanted to succeed, so they were the best at it. Like, that's what else do you want to do? Like, you don't want to be the worst at war, like, then you lose. Like, that's like, you want to be the best, of course, man. So it definitely makes sense to me. That weapon bat is pretty
Meat cleavers,
crazy.
push daggers,
okay.
and spike clubs.
Whoa.
They continued raiding even after other colonial units had already abandoned the practice. As their skills grew, Canadian trench raiders were eventually able to penetrate up to a kilometer behind enemy lines, dealing surprise death to Germans who had every reason to believe that they were safe from enemy bayonets. Sometimes trench raids of up to 900 men were hurled at enemy lines on a nightly basis. These were essentially mini-battles, except instead of holding ground, attackers were merely expected to spread death and chaos and then disappear. It is then no wonder that Germans called the Canadians stormtroopers and the British High Command called them shock troops. Germans developed a special contempt for the Canadian Corps, seeing them as unpredictable savages. In the final weeks of the war, Canadian Fred Hamilton would describe being singled out for a beating by a German colonel after he was taken prisoner. The colonel stated that Canadians took no prisoners and killed German wounded. As Canadian Corps Commander General Sir Arthur Currie would often boast after the war, his troops prided themselves on killing the enemy wherever and whenever they could be found. "We tried to make his life miserable," Currie said after the war.
Whoa. Jeez.
So, modern Canadians seem pretty friendly as long as you keep their hockey tickets in a safe, dry place. What was going on here that made the Canadian Army act in such ways that made it stand apart from other Allied armies in World War I? Before we begin, let's be clear that in no way are war atrocities being justified. We are just trying to figure out what was going through their minds. First, Canadians back then, especially from the backwoods, weren't as refined and polite as they are now. The Canadian landscape at that time was very rough, with many forests and wilderness. This made the Canadians very resilient. They also had a very hard life. These, and the strict discipline of their officers, created a very harsh force. What confused both friend and foe alike was why Canadians were so vicious. The French had seen large areas of their country destroyed and subjugated. The British had Zeppelins bombing their cities and U-boats trying to starve their populace. Canadians had left behind safe and prosperous homes that wouldn't see the slightest tinge of German aggression. One theory is that they widely believed that a Canadian officer had been crucified to a barn door and left to die by the Germans. This incident is generally considered by historians to be false. Another theory is that, because Canadian units were treated as cannon fodder colonials by the British, they were the spearhead of many battles. This put them in disproportionate contact with Germans attempting to surrender. After charging a German trench, one Canadian soldier stated that after the Germans killed half of his company, they tried to surrender. He didn't care and gave them the cold steel. One possible reason is that Canadians had never forgiven the Germans' first use of poison gas in 1915, which hit the Canadian units hardest. The Canadian Corps would eventually become the most enthusiastic user of poison gas on the Western Front. Another reason might be the German atrocities that are frankly too large to list here in detail. A couple of quick examples would be Germans shelling Paris and desecrating French graves. A whole other video could be made just on the German atrocities of World War I. Some Canadian commanders explicitly ordered their troops not to take prisoners. Why did the commanders order this? It's hard to say exactly, but some soldiers felt that POWs would slow them down and would eat their rations. By war's end, the Canadian Corps' reputation as an army of no mercy was known all across northern France. Canadians would go into a bar and boast to other allies about not taking prisoners. For many Canadians, the war had become a bit personal. As far as they were concerned, the Germans had something coming. However, Canadians did not have a monopoly on Western Front brutality, and prisoner execution stories were rife among all First World War armies. And Canada, unlike Germany, interestingly had a near-spotless record when it came to the treatment of civilians. Of the thousands of mentally shattered veterans that the Great War returned to Canada, some were most scarred by what they had been forced to do to others. A momentary act of vengeance in the fog of war could spark a lifetime of regret. One Canadian veteran, Alan Hart, was haunted for the rest of his life by his killing of a dazed German soldier who had been attempting to surrender but had forgotten to throw down his rifle. Modern Canadians should pause before condemning the sometimes shocking behavior of their First World War soldiers without knowing the stress and chaos of battle. More than 42,000 Germans would somehow survive their encounter with the Canadian Corps and live out the Great War as prisoners. However, untold numbers of Germans attempting to surrender to Canadian soldiers were met only with bayonets or bullets. Canadians had come to Europe to end a war, and it was a widely accepted opinion that they wouldn't do anybody any favors by fighting a war in half measures. War is terrible. They, like probably most soldiers, just wanted the war to end so they could go back home. If you liked the video you just...
Okay, yeah, that was definitely a deeper understanding. Yeah, I heard of some of those situations, like the ones with the grenades before, or on the previous video. That was like good to also look at the potential reasons why they were like that, and it makes sense to me when it talks about how Canadians treated civilians. That shows you like a true reflection of those Canadian soldiers. They treated them excellently, whereas the Germans were killing so many civilians, desecrating graves, doing a lot of horrible things. So yeah, very interesting, like great deep dive into that, or like short, I guess concise dive into it. But tell me what you think about this, tell me what you think about Canada's role in World War I. Thanks.